Hello everybody, and thank you for the introduction. My name's Scarlett Brown. I am Head of Research at an organisation called Tomorrow's Company. Tomorrow's Company is a think tank. We're a non-for-profit think tank, and we look at how business can be a better force for good in society. I'm going to talk to you a bit about a couple of big topics today, just a couple of casual topics, inclusive business and how it relates to intersectionality, and hopefully give us something that we can kind of talk about in the session following this one in the panel. So just a quick introduction. I've introduced you to Tomorrow's Company. Myself, I have a background in diversity and inclusion. I spent 4 years doing a PhD that looked at board diversity, which is a very interesting space to be in. I'll talk about in a second. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about that and a bit more about sort of the world of inclusive business, shall we say. So Tomorrow's Company itself as an organisation, we started back in 1995, and when we started, it started out as a group of chairmen, FTSE 100 companies, getting together to say, well, maybe it might be good if businesses and boards thought a little bit about their impact on society. Now, in 1995, that was quite a radical concept, and getting groups of people at that level of seniority together to talk about things like purpose, culture, values, sustainability, diversity, etc. That was actually quite radical. And this kind of radical idea that a business should have a purpose beyond simply making profit. So that was back in sort of 1995, and the world has moved quite fast on since then. And I think it's just an interesting thing to kind of reflect on where we are in history. And I thought, I mean, what you said, Dan, for me, I kind of scribbled it down, and I think it's really, really important because any time that somebody comes at you with something which is a kind of linear narrative that says we used to be in a bad situation and now, you know, we used to be really oppressed and now we're not oppressed, or we used to be a lot less diverse and now we're better, I think it should always be challenged, because actually it's very easy to say that we are in 2019 more enlightened, more inclusive, more open to things than we were 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. It's just fundamentally not the case for a lot of groups of people. And I think particularly when we're looking at power and power shifts, like you say, in some ways, I think Donald Trump is a great example that we have not moved forward in terms of identity politics, supporting people who are facing oppression. So in terms of businesses, that kind of gives us an interesting framework. So, you know, if I was doing this to a group of undergraduates, I would start with some highlights about Milton Friedman in the 1970s, wrote a piece where he said, you know, the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. That is the only reason a business should exist. Now, interestingly, through the sort of 1980s, 1990s, that was the dominant narrative. And even though it was being challenged a lot, particularly by sort of critical scholars, it did remain being the dominant narrative, that a business is there in order to increase profits and to give money back to its shareholders. Now, that has been sort of challenged since, not least of all because of the financial crisis. But I suppose, again, it's important to flag that, you know, it's worth mentioning that before the 1970s, and even when you look back 100, 200, 300 years, businesses weren't always this way. One of the biggest examples that's brought up in the UK particularly is the Bourneville example. So what since became Cadbury's and unfortunately has now become part of the Kraft family, so has sort of lost its way a little bit. But, you know, a chocolate maker, a food producer, that saw their job as not only was their role to, you know, make money as a business and to sell products, but they took really, really good care of their staff. Everybody lived in the area. You can still go and see the sort of chocolate box houses in Bourneville where everybody lived. And it had what we would now not refer to, but definitely did then, as a very paternalistic responsibility for their employees. They took care of them because they understood that the biggest responsibility they have is to make sure the people that work in their factories and they work in their organisations are taken care of. Not because there's a business case for it, but because there is a social case for it. So I would, you know, it's very important not to think that this idea that businesses should have a purpose beyond profit is a totally radical and new concept. That said, it does feel that way. I've got a couple of sort of headlines on the right-hand side here. Those of you who read the Financial Times or have to as part of your work, like I do, there has been a lot of articles about this. And there is also, if you're looking for something fun to do on your coffee break, if you go to the Financial Times, they now have a game that you can do where you can put yourself in the shoes of a CEO trying to make decisions between whether to focus on purpose or on profit. It's incredible to me that an organisation like the Financial Times is now running significant series on how businesses need to be more purpose-led. It is a real sort of indicator of how things have changed. A couple of things up on the screen that you'll see here, sort of indicators of the tide sort of turning. The first at the top is, this is a group in America called the Business Roundtable. They're an extremely significant group of business leaders, and they have in the last couple of months amended their 2-decade declaration. And what their declaration used to say is corporations exist principally to serve their shareholders. That was their belief system. And they have since changed it to say, you know, while we all have our own corporate purpose, we share a fundamental commitment to all our stakeholders. And that can seem really obvious, but that is such a significant change for businesses to be taking from where we once were. The piece at the bottom is a section from those of you who know your company law. This is from the UK Companies Act, and this has had a lot of debate in the last few years. Largely because Theresa May used it as part of her bid for Prime Minister, and then some of the work she did when she wasn't focusing on Brexit was around encouraging companies to talk about how they are doing this. So what this part of the company law effectively says is that directors are beholden to their stakeholders, and while they might be legally required to prioritise the needs of their shareholders, they are also required to acknowledge the needs of their stakeholders, and that includes people. Now, this drive for kind of purpose and you know, the sort of change that we're seeing, and particularly I see a lot in my work, is being driven by a huge number of factors, and it becomes extremely relevant for our sort of work in diversity. I think the biggest thing, and it'd be interesting to see how this is also affecting our work internally in organisations, is the kind of reputational damage which is at stake now. Companies' risk of being reputationally damaged from treating one person or a group of people or the planet badly is so much higher than it used to be, and the kind of democratisation of media and the rise of social media has made that a really big thing. You know, a kind of disenfranchisement in wider society with businesses more generally, particularly since the financial crisis, and criticising companies that are seen to be putting profits before their people. There are also, and again, we see this a lot in the work that we do, you know, more and more businesses being led by people who genuinely believe that businesses should have a social impact. There's more and more evidence that it leads to long-term return, although I'm sure I'm not alone at being somebody in the room who is, I find it very uncomfortable to say that there is a business case for diversity. I think that if we get sucked in too much to there being a business case, we end up sort of falling over ourselves. But there is evidence of a return of when companies think about themselves as social beings as well as economical ones. And this also, again, really leads to their need to be retaining and attracting the right people. So the companies that we talk to who have gone through a kind of a sense of enlightenment and for seeking purpose, often they say it's because it's the only way they get to attract good people, because people want to go and work for the snazzy new startups. They don't want to come and work for the banks anymore because the banks haven't got the best reputation. So where does that leave us in terms of diversity? I'm really pleased that I get to be the first person today to talk about, to actually raise up Kimberly Crenshaw's initial definition of intersectionality. And then I was really displeased to see that in the slide I've spelt Kimberly's name wrong. So managed to trip over myself. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to flag this because when I used to be an academic and teach concepts like intersectionality, it's a concept which is in some ways, as Dan says, extremely simple, and also in some ways is used sort of incorrectly. So I think it's extremely important, as Dan has already mentioned, that intersectionality is treated as something which relates to power. But it's really important that it is not, that we don't just see it as being additive. So it's not just that a black woman will experience two levels of issues where a white man doesn't. It's about needing to have an inherent and to interrogate the way that we do everything and the way that the organisations run. But I do think that it actually then provides a really useful concept, and this I'm sure will come up again and again today, but that actually diversity initiatives of the past focused a lot on counting bodies. They've, counting the kinds of people and focusing on specific groups of people, but that actually this can be quite divisive. It's amazing how often I'll speak to an organisation who wants to focus on one thing and they say, we did women last year, we did the women's networks last year, so now we're going to put focus on our LGBTQ, etc. network. As if diversity is just one thing that you prioritise and you have to choose which group you give your funding to this year. And actually I think it's been really interesting watching how that can also affect not only identity politics, but I think internal movements. So we've seen it a lot in the feminist movements where we've led to divisiveness because it seems like it's a zero-sum game, that when it's taken from one, it gets taken from the other. So I think that it's something like intersectionality can be really helpful. When I was doing my work on women on boards, I was amazed with how often I would hear, there was so much focus on getting women onto boards, and we spent 10 years counting the number of women and pushing companies to appoint women, and we achieved our target of 30%. In the UK, and then everybody kind of went quiet, and actually what it's led to is an assumption that it's easier for women, which is one of the biggest backlashes we have to any kind of positive discrimination, so-called. But it's also led to a lack of diversity. We've not actually seen any changes in terms of a shift of power. We've not really seen any diversity in any measure other than gender. And at the same time, there's a lot of kind of congratulating each other on what we've achieved. So if we don't take an intersectional approach, then we won't be able to see sort of further movement. I'm going to, before we move, I'll finish and we move into the panel, I'm just going to bring up two fairly quick examples of where I think perhaps an intersectional approach has started to help with organisations we've worked with. The first is I want to talk about social mobility, or as we used to call it in sociology, class, but businesses like talking about social mobility. It's a more palatable way of saying class. Now this again, although I don't want to be too additive, this is based on some research that was done by some brilliant scholars at LSE who found evidence for the class pay gap. And we know that there is evidence for the gender pay gap, and there's increasing evidence of the ethnic pay gap. But they actually went into it and said, if they look at a measure of social background, then they can also find evidence for a class pay gap, which means that, as they found, if you are a black British woman with working class origins, then the gap between you and your white male middle class origin colleagues can be as much as £20,000 a year. So this is looking at people at the very top. Now, they also did a piece of work in a professional services firm looking at how this actually manifested itself, because it is not just simply, oh, well, we're looking at the promotion levels. There was something much, much more in depth going on. And so it's interesting to look at the professional services firm as an example for this, because they have been to a lot of work on social mobility. And a great success story was Grant Thornton UK and other accountancies are available, but others have done this as well. And what they realised was that because they were measuring people coming in, they were looking at university attainment, so they were looking at university names and also whether or not somebody got a third, a 2-1, etc. And they removed, basically overnight, they said, right, we're no longer going to require somebody to come from to have a 2-1 or higher, and we're going to stop looking at the university title, so what university they came from. And in the first year they did that, the backgrounds of people changed significantly, the people that they got applying and the people that they later recruited. And the reason I think this is important is because they wouldn't have said that they were taking an intersectional approach. They were looking at social mobility. That's the thing they had decided to focus on that year. But what they found was when they did that, it led to an increased number of people from black and minority ethnic groups. It led to an increase in the number of women. And what that's led them to do since is to also take out things, and I think, again, this is really important, around measurements, around extracurricular activities, which we know are extremely divided by whether or not you are a woman or whether or not you come from a middle class background, and the kinds of work experience that are available to you. what that meant is that taking a focus on one has opened up the other pictures, and they are now able to have a broader conversation about diversity in a way that I think that has been easier when you start with class than perhaps when you start with gender. Would be an interesting debate topic that we can talk about in a second. And the final thing I'll say about this example is that this quote at the bottom is actually, I think, the most important in terms of when we look at intersectionality, because this really highlights to me why it is not feasible for us to focus just on a single category. And that's because, particularly when you look at class is not just about how much money you earn, and it's not just about where you came from. It's something that embeds the way that you are as a person. And I would really recommend the book, the reason I've put it up on the screen, The Class Ceiling, is because what the authors did is then go into organisations like accountants and there was another one, a TV company, and they looked at how it was that this pay gap was occurring. And one of the ways that it was occurring is through the ability of individuals to do something called sort of studied informality. And so that way that people feel comfortable with each other when they're around power, with the way that people from higher backgrounds, from middle class backgrounds, etc., were able to be informal and make jokes with each other, and were then sort of, they were looking at the way that power was reproducing itself. And the reason I think that's important, and why that quote around, class is something beneath your clothes, under your skin, it's about the individual that you are. You could replace that with gender or with race or any other category, actually. It's about the person that we are. So by taking an initial focus on social mobility, they were able to sort of open up a lot of their diversity approaches to focus on the individual and how they are actually moving through the organisation. Because if we're not looking at the whole organisation, then we're not going to see any change. Finally, and I will be quick so we don't run over too much, but just to say this is a piece of work we've been doing with Tomorrow's Company, and similarly it's something where we've gone in with one issue and have managed to broaden it out. So we're doing two pieces of work, one on mental health in organisations and one on financial well-being. And what we're trying to do is to get organisations to care about these two things and look at how they are tied together. You can see up on the screen some of the facts that we found, and one of the big things that I've been trying to, when we've been going into organisations and trying to get them to engage with the financial well-being of their employees, is that actually if you are going to look at the diversity of your workforce, you have to think about their financial well-being. Because we know that when we're looking at, this was a project that was actually designed to try and reduce in-work poverty, and we know that some of the biggest signifiers of potentially falling into financial difficulty are whether or not you're a man or a woman, are whether or not you come from a black minority ethnic background, and whether or not you're a parent. Because one of the biggest and most expensive things in life is being a parent. So what we're trying to do is to get organisations to think about the financial well-being of their people. This also ties with mental health. I'd be surprised if any of you were in or working with an organisation who doesn't claim to have a mental health agenda at the moment. It's become a really, really big thing. But it also ties extremely neatly in quite a depressing way with other categories. So I think that any kind of mental health agenda is not going to be able to not look at measures of diversity. And the reason that that's important, and this is my final points to leave you with, I think the reason why that is important is because, as I started with in this presentation, more and more businesses and organisations are claiming to have a purpose, they're claiming to look after their people, they're claiming to have a mental health agenda. And with that is opportunities for us as diversity and inclusion scholars or practitioners to use that as a Trojan horse to get diversity back on the agenda. Because actually it's really difficult to keep something on the agenda when businesses feel like they've achieved something. So use these kind of pressure points for businesses to do that. And I think finally, my work overall gives me the picture that actually the most forward-thinking companies are not those who say, yes, we've got a diversity agenda, we've ticked that, or we've got a mental health programme, but they're those who have the capacity and the courage to change the whole way that they do business. And they might look at their business models, they'll look at their recruitment, they'll look at the way that they treat their people. But there is so much to learn about that, and we have an opportunity to put things like diversity on the agenda if we can get that together. Thank you. I will stop there, and apologies for running over, Chair.